and find personal stories to sort of take away from the new, sort of always talking about the news cycle, for instance. And, drinking has obviously been for a very long time, or had been at the center of workplace culture, right? It was, Christmas parties or holiday parties, whatever you want to call them, and just get togethers. Alcohol is a staple when it comes to after hours socializing, team building, connecting with customers at offsite events or business lunches and so on. But the impacts of it can be pretty devastating, as I'm sure each and every one of us have either witnessed or experienced ourselves over the years. Alcoholism in the workplace is a huge financial burden for companies, not to mention on individuals, costing billions annually in absenteeism, health issues, on the job injuries, and other losses in productivity. And it obviously not only affects you, the employee, but also those around you, those you work with, those you work for. And one of the big problems with it, obviously, is the stigma around alcohol abuse can lead employees to try to hide the issue. And perhaps counterintuitively, the best way to help yourself and to protect your career, save your job, is to be candid about it. That's where my next guest comes in. David Whitten is not only the founding partner at a major Toronto employment law firm, he also struggled for years with a drinking problem. So he knows firsthand about the struggles from both a personal and professional perspective. It turns out that there are lots of legal protections for issues with problem drinking in the workplace that have been in place for decades. However, they only kick in if the person is honest with their employer about their challenges with alcohol or any other substance abuse, for that matter. David A. Whitten is the founding partner at Whitten and Lublin Employment Lawyers in Toronto, and he joins me tonight. Thanks for your time, David.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Ben. Appreciate it.
This strikes me as such an important topic because we talk so much about issues around substance abuse, whether it be alcohol or narcotics or anything else, and how they affect home lives and social lives. But clearly, I mean, we spend a lot of our time at work, and it's an area where substance abuse can have a huge impact.
Absolutely. I mean, not only in my profession, it's rampant within the profession, just dealing with the stresses of what we do on a day-to-day basis. But as an employment lawyer, I see how it impacts other people in the workplace, not just lawyers, and also their personal lives. It can be incredibly destructive.
You came at this, you wrote about this, and I think you thought it was important to put it out there because there's a lot of stigma still around it about confessing to these things. But you speak of this from a place of experience as well, which makes it all the more impactful, I think.
Yeah, I do. I'm a recovering alcoholic myself. I'm proud to stand up and be counted in that regard, because I think one of the hallmarks of alcoholism or addiction generally is denial. And I myself lived through that for over a decade, where I just consistently found excuses for why I was drinking as much as I was, and the damage that it was doing, I would try to ignore. And so I felt that it was time to speak up and come out of the shadows and advise that there is hope for others, but you have to be honest with yourself and your employer, because the legal protection that's available, and there is a substantial protection available for people with addiction issues. For example, alcohol use disorder is regarded and recognized as a disability, quote unquote, under human rights legislation. And so that means that if an employer knew or ought to have known that the person had an issue with alcoholism or addiction, that they have to accommodate it to the point of undue hardship. And you just raised an interesting point before we went live about the remote work environment, because I hadn't really thought of that. But I would say that, so the fact that people are working remotely more often than not nowadays, and that it might be easier for somebody to hide an issue with alcohol working remotely than it would be in the workplace if they smell of alcohol or it's obvious from their demeanor that they're impaired. And you make a really good point there, because I actually think it disadvantages employees with addiction issues, because one of the concepts in human rights legislation is that your employer's duty to accommodate is triggered when they know or ought to have known that the person had an issue with addiction. And so known is obviously the best, easiest way to make your employer aware is to disclose to them, I have an issue with alcohol or some other substance that I'm working through, and I require some assistance. Working an accommodation is the word we use in the workplace. And so that, but back to denial. Alcoholics, addicts don't want to admit that. Right. So what I've seen in my practice, though, is back when we were all in the office, is there would come time where there would be occasions where an employer will deem to have ought to have known that the person had an issue with addiction, even though they hadn't disclosed, because of how they were behaving in the office, because they smelled of alcohol and there was no way of denying it. Versus now, in a scenario where somebody's working from home, it is less likely that an employee can rely upon that ought to have known default in the legislation if they're not actually in the office and they're holding it together on Zoom or Teams meetings. That protection will not be engaged for those people unless they are obviously impaired on a call or they disclose, which they're going to be reluctant to do.
It's such an interesting dilemma because I think people's first instinct is to hide it. And yet by hiding it, you deprive yourself of the help that you would need in order to say, hold on to your job. In fact, if sometimes people end up drinking more, consuming more drugs because they're stressed about their performance and losing their job, but by not admitting it, they're in fact, digging that hole even deeper. What was it like, just even from your personal experience, to actually have to admit to it? Because it strikes me as something that's just so difficult to do.
Yeah, oh, it is. And you're right. It becomes a downward spiral into a toilet because you're ultimately the shame, it builds over time based on the aberrant behavior that comes from these types of having these issues when you're promise yourself you're not going to do something and you do it anyway. And so the shame starts to build, and the only way to diffuse or eliminate that shame, at least in the short term, is to consume more of your drug of choice. And so things start to escalate quite quickly because as things get worse, you become heavier and heavier into your addiction. And I absolutely saw this pattern in my own life. And I was interestingly just out for lunch with a lawyer who's just come back to the practice after 2.5 years off in recovery,
Wow.
got their license back. And to his credit, he's going to be wreaking justice in his path yet again.
Right.
But I remember where I was at the time. And it got to the point where, from my perspective, and I truly believe that this was some form of divine intervention. I'm not a religious man, I'm a spiritual one. And that's part of my
Mhm.
recovery process that brought me to the point where I had a rock bottom experience. That's usually the gateway to recovery, where I had done something that, in my view, it was in my personal life, it wasn't professionally, it was so shameful that I couldn't ignore the elephant in the room anymore. And it got to the point for me where I realized that I was at a tipping point, that if I didn't make changes soon, I was going to burn it all to the ground. My marriage had fallen apart. I was living out on my own at that time. And I scared myself into rehab because I was like, I can't continue this anymore. I remember that morning when I woke up and had alcohol poisoning and I was suicidal, Ben. And I looked
Yeah.
around my life and I'm like, this is not right. Like, I have a wonderful life. I had a wonderful life before I blew it up with my wife. My profession is going well for the most part, but it's starting to be eroded by this. And here I am, too sick to go into work from alcohol poisoning. And that was really the tipping point for me because up until that point, I was able to drag my butt into the office on a Monday or a Tuesday, and I prided myself on that. I was like,
Right.
as much as I'm consuming, I am still functional in the office. But that day, I went into the office and I was shaking and sweating so badly that I had to leave and tell my assistant to cancel all my appointments. And that's the day that I knew that I needed help.
Yeah. I mean, it strikes me that you must have known fairly quickly when you stopped just how much of a difference it had made.
Well, that's an interesting point because the early days of recovery tend to be a little dark
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you have to face this reality. Like when I went into treatment, I was just going in for a tune up. Like I
Mhm.
thought, teach me how to drink responsibly, and then I'll come back out swinging for the stands.
Right.
And I remember when I called the facility at the time, I told them that's what I wanted to do. And it was a 28-day program. And I said, look, I'm just coming for 2 weeks because I just need a tune up. And I
Right.
remember them
I'm
on
just
the
on the
other.
D I'm just on the DL briefly. Yeah.
Yeah. Just a little refresher course on how to be a normal human being again. And I remember them on the other side. They were a little incredulous. They're like, "Look, David, why don't you just get yourself over here and we'll talk about it some more." And so I got there, and within 3 days, I'd realized that with their help, I was an alcoholic, and that if I wanted to live my best life, I should never drink again. And so that dawning realization is a little depressing initially. So because
Yeah.
alcohol effectively had become my best friend. Like it was the thing that I hung around with it all the time. I wanted it there every time I was celebrating, every time I was mourning something. It was my go-to.
Yeah.
And my best friend had alienated me from other people. And so it's asking you to break up with your best friend, even though that person is killing you. As bizarre as it may sound, it was a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, I suppose so much of your life is tied up in the rewards of it and the crutch, right? The reward and the crutch, that cycle of it.
100%. I didn't know how to celebrate or deal with the challenges of my life without alcohol. I'd lost touch with that. And so it's a new way of life. But this lawyer I was out with today, both of us agreed at the end of the day that the program that we are in has given us a toolbox for life that actually gives us a leg up on the normal people of the world who, quote unquote, who don't have addiction issues, because we now have a playbook to go to that when life gets tough, we can default to something other than a substance to get through it.
David Witten is founding partner at Witten and Lublin Employment Lawyers in Toronto. We're talking about substance abuse and work. We spend so much time at work that any of us who've ever had any kind of trouble with a substance will know that it can really impact your work life as well as your social life, amongst other things. David, I guess what's important to remember in all this is that if you're willing to admit to a problem, that you're not necessarily, I mean, I think the fear a lot in this, in every position, in every job, and I suppose it depends on the job you're in, but that being upfront about having an issue, if you want to go cope with it, is probably the best thing you can do in your employment situation to save your job, really.
Absolutely. It's to be candid with your employer if you're concerned that you have an issue, because it will engage that protection under the Human Rights Code. But I think there's another reason why I encourage people to be candid is there's this huge stigma in a lot of our minds around this concept of alcoholism. I had one myself. I always
Mhm.
associated the alcoholic with the sort of dumpster diving wino that maybe we grew up with or saw in
Mhm.
Hollywood.
The,
And
the paper
I
bag,
thought,
the paper bag, yeah.
yeah, right. And like I didn't sit on park benches drinking out of paper bags. So how could I be an alcoholic? I was drinking premium alcohol.
Right. Yeah.
But you come to a realization that that's not the line of demarcation. But my point though is that alcoholism and addiction has touched so many. And I was initially quite reluctant to be candid, even in recovery, with the fact that I have had this experience and that I can no longer drink and that I consider myself a recovering alcoholic. But as I got more comfortable with it, Ben, and I started to share with other people, I was consistently surprised by the compassion and understanding that I received from other human beings, because it appears that addiction has touched a lot of our lives. And so my
Yeah.
point is that you going to your employer with this, there's this reluctance, but you might be surprised if you disclose that you have a concern with this, that you might hear something back from them that they have an alcoholic parent. I've encountered cases, and when we run into each other in the practice, I know one recovering addict to another, it's a special bond. Because,
Mhm.
like, for example, I've been dealing with some clients and I'll make a comment that would, about not drinking, and then it will come out that they too are in recovery themselves. And there's this connection that we immediately have. And so my point is that you're not alone. And in the program I'm in, we say you're never alone. And the reality is that a lot of people have a lot more understanding and compassion for this issue than you would ever think.
Right. Again, I think the fear always is that if you confess to something like a substance abuse disorder within the workplace, that you're going to be punished for it, right?
Yeah, and for sure. But if, first of all, there's legislated protection against that. You cannot take reprisal action against somebody for disclosing a medical condition. And so if your employer is um, unsophisticated enough to try to exact some sort of punishment or reprisal action against you, you have significant legal remedies at your disposal. But I would say in the modern era now, where we have a shortage of skilled people to fill the available jobs, employers are going to be reluctant to just kick somebody to the door because they've disclosed an issue of addiction, or they're aware that the person has addiction, because there's an opportunity cost associated with replacing that person and potentially a legal cost with trying to terminate or impact their employment as a result.
Right. And I suppose that is certainly, I mean, being upfront about it is certainly better than the alternative is watching your performance at work for which you can be dismissed go down the toilet because of a substance issue order, right? A substance abuse order,
Well,
disorder.
yeah, and I have to tell you, I have to say as well too that one of the elephants in the room that becomes the hardest to deal with in the later stages of addiction is the fact that we're aware at some level that we have a problem with our drug of choice. And we've been ignoring it. The addict typically will ignore it for years, decades. And the incredible relief that comes from disclosure to somebody else is an essential step to recovery because finally we shine a light on the elephant and we start to deal with the issue. And so not only is it the right thing to do legally, but it is really the gateway to this step to recovery.
David, just listening to you, I could tell it is not always easy, but it sounds like it has definitely been worth it.
Oh, I cannot. My friend and I were talking about this over lunch. There's sometimes you'll hear somebody use the phrase, "I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic." And initially, I never understood that. Like, what are you grateful for? As somebody who's who's suffering from that as well. But 8 years into my sobriety, I know what they're talking about. Ben, I'm actually grateful that I had to work through this issue because I know myself far better than I ever would have normally. If I didn't have to encounter this, I am so much more appreciative for the life that I have. And I have the pleasure and the honor of helping others in some small shape or form by talking about it. That has enriched my life in a way that it would never have been if I was just somebody who never had to face these issues down. So yes, it was the best decision I ever made. And I can tell anybody out there that ends up listening to this, if you're at all concerned, I can virtually guarantee that if you get sober and you follow a program of recovery, your life will get better in ways that you never thought possible.
Well, David, congratulations on your 8 years. Thank you so much for sharing your story and being so candid about it. Thanks so much once again.
Thank you, Ben.
Night begins the journey.